They kissed on stage in front of 1,000 people. The cameras captured every second. His pregnant wife watched from the audience. For 5 years, she'd built his empire with her own hands while he chased the woman who wanted to destroy him. 72 hours later, she walked into his boardroom as the CEO who would decide his fate. Elizabeth Hartford. Mitchell stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park Avenue penthouse, right hand resting on the curve of her 8-month belly, left hand gripping the phone that had just buzzed with a message from William Mitchell. The text was short-coded in the careful language they'd developed over the past week. The final report arrived. "I was right about Rebecca Stone. We need to talk before tonight. This is worse than we thought." Behind her, James Mitchell paced the marble foyer with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking to Rebecca Stone for the 4th time that afternoon. His voice carried a quality Elizabeth hadn't heard in years, an eagerness, an energy, a spark of something that felt like youth reclaimed. "Rebecca, the merger announcement tonight will be perfect. Our two companies becoming one. It's poetic, isn't it? Our two companies becoming one." Elizabeth closed her eyes. He didn't even hear the double meaning in his own words. The penthouse stretched across 6,000 square feet of Manhattan real estate, every surface a testament to Elizabeth's eye for detail. She'd chosen the Carrara marble, the Murano chandeliers, the Rothko paintings that dominated the living room walls. She'd spent 18 months working with architects to create a home that balanced James's need for modern minimalism with her own appreciation for warmth. The result was spectacular and cold, a monument to everything they'd built together and everything that had slowly died in the building. Her son, she thought of the baby as hers. Now, not theirs, kicked hard against her ribs. The sensation was both reassuring and heartbreaking, as if the child already understood that his father existed somewhere beyond reach, separated by more than the 20 feet of polished floor. The silver Valentino gown lay across their bed, custom designed to accommodate her pregnancy while maintaining the elegance expected of Mrs. James Mitchell at the Starlight Children's Foundation Gala. Looking at it now, Elizabeth saw it for what it was, a costume for a role she no longer wanted to play. Have you ever stood in a room with someone you love and felt completely alone? Have you ever realized that the person sleeping beside you every night has already left? James ended his call and walked toward her, adjusting the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo. At 35, he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd turned his father's $50 billion company into a $150 billion empire. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp, his eyes the gray-blue of storm clouds over the Atlantic. 5 years ago, she'd thought him the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Now she just saw the stranger he'd become. "You're not ready yet." Elizabeth turned from the window. "Almost." He barely glanced at her, checking the Patek Philippe on his wrist, the watch she'd given him for their 4th anniversary, $180,000 she'd paid from her own Hartford trust fund. "Rebecca's team wants me at the plaza by 7 for press photos before the main event. My driver will take you separately." "I'm riding with William." A flicker of irritation crossed James's face. "Why?" "Because your father asked me to. He wants to arrive together." "Dad's been acting strange lately. Has he said anything to you?" The question was casual, but Elizabeth heard the edge beneath it. James had always been sensitive about his father's opinions, desperate to prove he'd surpassed the man who'd built Sterling Industries from nothing. "He's worried about you. Worried I'm finally succeeding beyond his achievements." The bitterness came through sharp and clear. "He built a regional medical supply company. I've created a national infrastructure that's about to merge with the most advanced predictive AI in the industry. If he can't see the difference, he's worried you're forgetting what matters." James laughed, a sound without warmth. "Tonight I'm announcing the biggest tech merger in 5 years. I know exactly what matters." He moved toward the door, then paused. "That silver dress looks good on you. Don't be late. The announcement is at 10 sharp. The door closed behind him. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a period at the end of a sentence. Elizabeth walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on her belly, the other reaching for the small clutch that would accompany her tonight. Inside, phone lipstick and a USB drive containing 3 months of investigation into Rebecca Stone. She wouldn't need it. William had copies. The lawyers had copies. The evidence was already distributed where it needed to be. But having it felt like insurance, a talisman against the disaster she knew was coming. The baby kicked again, harder this time. "I know," she whispered. "I know." 3 years earlier, Elizabeth had stood in a different room, the 15th floor of Sterling Industries headquarters, surrounded by computer monitors displaying lines of code she'd written herself. She wasn't James Mitchell's decorative wife playing at having a career. She was the chief systems architect who'd designed the entire logistics infrastructure that powered Sterling's expansion into medical device distribution. The memory came back with painful clarity. The boardroom presentation, 15 executives watching as she explained the hub-and-spoke model that would revolutionize their delivery system. Her laser pointer had traced the routes on the projected blueprint. The New Jersey hub isn't just a warehouse. It's the only FDA-certified cold chain facility within 50 miles of 3 major hospital networks. This positioning cuts delivery time by 60% and ensures compliance with every federal regulation. I've personally coded the tracking system that monitors temperature every 30 seconds. Any deviation triggers an automatic alert to both the driver and our central monitoring station. The board had been impressed. James, sitting at the far end of the table, had smiled with something that looked like pride. After the meeting, he'd pulled her into his office and held her close. "You're brilliant. This will save us $40 million a year." Those were the last words of genuine appreciation she could remember. 6 months later, Forbes published a cover story on Sterling Industries' revolutionary distribution model. The reporter had interviewed only James. The article quoted him extensively. CEO James Mitchell pioneered a breakthrough distribution model that combines geographic strategy with real-time monitoring technology. Mitchell's vision has positioned Sterling Industries as the industry leader in reliable, compliant medical supply delivery. Elizabeth had read the article 3 times, waiting for her name to appear. It never did. She'd shown it to James that evening, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "They didn't mention that I designed the system." He'd glanced up from his tablet, distracted. "That's how these things work. The CEO gets the credit. It's not personal, it's just how business journalism functions. Besides, you know what you accomplished. Isn't that what matters?" She'd wanted to say that recognition mattered, that being erased from her own work mattered, that watching him accept praise for her innovations mattered. Instead, she'd nodded and changed the subject, filing the hurt away with all the other small disappointments that had been accumulating like snow before an avalanche. Her contributions were specific and documented 3 regional distribution hubs in New Jersey, Ohio, and Texas, 240,000 lines of Python and SQL code, 11 months of negotiations with the FDA to secure certification, training programs for 200 warehouse staff, $40 million in annual savings, exactly as James had predicted. None of it appeared in any article, any press release, any public acknowledgement. The first time James mentioned Rebecca Stone's name, Elizabeth had been setting the table for dinner. It was a Wednesday evening, rare in that James had come home before 9. She'd made his favorite pasta, opened a bottle of wine, tried to create the kind of domestic scene they used to share before his schedule became a wall between them. "I met someone interesting today." James had poured himself a glass of the Barolo, swirling it absently. "Rebecca Stone, CEO of Phoenix Innovations. She's remarkable. Stanford grad, built her company from nothing in 10 years. She wants to discuss a potential partnership." Elizabeth had looked up from the salad she was plating. "What kind of partnership?" "Merging our distribution network with her AI-driven predictive analytics. It could revolutionize the industry. Imagine knowing what supplies a hospital will need 3 days before they run out, automatic reordering, zero waste, perfect efficiency." Her business instinct had kicked in immediately, the same analytical mind that had designed Sterling's infrastructure, now evaluating this new proposition. "Did you check her financials?" Phoenix Innovations has been burning through venture capital. Their last funding round was 18 months ago. They need our infrastructure more than we need their software. James had smiled the way he smiled when she said something he found charmingly naive. "Always the cautious one. That's why I need you to balance my vision with practicality." But there had been something in his voice when he said Rebecca Stone's name, an undertone Elizabeth couldn't quite identify. Energy. Interest. a spark she hadn't heard in months. She'd chosen not to ask more questions. That was her first mistake. 7 days before the gala, William Mitchell appeared at the penthouse door at 10 in the morning unannounced. He was 68 years old, silver hair immaculate, wearing a Tom Ford suit in charcoal gray that matched the ones his son favored. He carried a worn leather briefcase, a gift from his late wife Margaret 20 years ago, kept pristine despite its age. Elizabeth had been reviewing code on her laptop, trying to maintain the professional identity that was slowly being absorbed into her role as James Mitchell's wife. Seeing William at the door, his face grave, she'd known immediately that something was wrong. "Elizabeth, my dear, we need to talk." They'd sat in the living room, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. William had opened the briefcase with careful deliberation, removing a file folder thick enough to require rubber bands to keep it closed. 3 months ago, when James first mentioned the Phoenix merger, I had a feeling, an instinct. William's hands, normally steady, showed the slightest tremor as he removed the rubber bands. Rebecca Stone. The name was familiar. I remembered James mentioning her during his Stanford years. So I hired Kroll Associates to investigate. He'd handed her the file. Elizabeth had opened it, and her world had shifted. The first 20 pages detailed shell corporations, each with a name that meant nothing to a stranger, but everything to someone who knew the geography of James and Rebecca's past. Sequoia 7, LLC, named for the Stanford dormitory where they'd lived. Palo Alto Holdings, the city where they'd had their first date. Room 407, Ventures. Elizabeth had stopped breathing when she saw that one had looked up at William with a question she couldn't voice. "Their dorm room number," William had confirmed, his voice gentle with the pain of delivering a wound. "She used their shared history to name the companies she created to destroy my son." Pages 21 through 45 mapped the financial architecture, 7 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and Bermuda. The network diagram showed how money would flow once the trap was sprung. Sterling's merger announcement would pump the stock price. Rebecca's shell corporations would short Sterling stock, betting on the price to fall. Then something would trigger a crisis, the stock would crash, and Rebecca's vulture fund partners would initiate a leveraged buyout using Sterling's own assets as collateral. Phoenix would absorb Sterling. James would lose everything. Estimated profit for Rebecca, $3.2 billion. Estimated loss for James, everything. Pages 46 through 60 showed surveillance photos. James leaving the gym at 7 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. James at the Starbucks on Park Avenue ordering his Grande Americano with no sugar. James leaving the office at 8:17 p.m., photographed from across the street with a telephoto lens. 18 months of surveillance, every pattern documented, every routine cataloged. Rebecca Stone had studied her target with the precision of a general planning an invasion. The final section, pages 61 through 75, contained email transcripts. Elizabeth had read them with growing horror. From Rebecca Stone to Kenneth Chen, Sterling Industries, CFO. "Your consulting contract with Phoenix will be $500,000 annually effective upon merger completion. In return, I need your vote supporting the merger and your vote against James Mitchell if any confidence issues arise." Kenneth Chen's reply, "Understood. I'm with you." A second thread showed identical communication with Sandra Morrison, Sterling's head of strategic planning. 2 board members bought and paid for waiting to betray the company they were supposed to protect. Elizabeth had looked up from the file, her hands shaking. "Does James know?" William's face had aged a decade in the pause before he answered. "I showed him the preliminary report 10 days ago. Not all of this, I didn't have the email evidence yet or the complete financial trail, but enough. The shell corporations, the surveillance. I begged him to delay the merger to investigate further before committing to anything." "What did he say?" The pain in William's voice was visceral. "He said I was paranoid, that I couldn't accept his success surpassing mine. He said I was a sentimentalist who didn't understand modern business. He accused me of sabotaging him because I favored you over him." William had looked away, blinking back tears. He chose to believe her over me, over his father. Elizabeth had sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what she'd learned. The woman she'd vaguely worried about as a potential affair was actually orchestrating a corporate assassination. The merger James saw as his crowning achievement was a Trojan horse. The partner he trusted was his executioner. "There's one more thing you need to know." William had withdrawn a final document from the briefcase, this one stapled and highlighted. Rebecca Stone and James weren't just classmates at Stanford. They were lovers, dated for 3 years. Everyone thought they'd get married after graduation. Elizabeth had felt the words land like physical blows. "What happened?" "James met you. At that Museum of Modern Art fundraiser in San Francisco, your family was sponsoring the event. He came back to Stanford and told Rebecca he was ending their relationship. He said he'd met someone whose family connections would help him build the empire he wanted." Those were his words, according to Rebecca's roommate, who still lives in the area and was happy to talk to our investigator. "Elizabeth Hartford is the foundation I need." The room had spun slightly. Elizabeth had gripped the arm of the sofa to steady herself. "Rebecca never forgot that rejection," William had continued. "She built Phoenix Innovations specifically to become James's equal and then his superior. This merger isn't business. It's the culmination of a 10-year revenge plan. And my son is walking into it blind because he'd rather believe he's conquered an old flame than admit his father might be right." But what nobody knew, not James, not Rebecca, not even the world watching, was that Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment. Not for 7 days, for 7 years, ever since she first felt invisible in her own marriage. She had been gathering her strength, protecting her son's future, and waiting for the moment when silence would become her most powerful weapon. She'd looked at William, her mind already 3 moves ahead. "What do? We save Sterling Industries, even if that means destroying my son's illusions." Elizabeth had placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick as if in agreement. "I need 3 things. First, my family lawyer, Robert Hartford at Hartford and Associates. Second, I need to know exactly what shares I control through the Hartford Trust. Third," she'd paused, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders, "I need to let James fall, because he won't listen until he hits the ground." 6 years earlier, Elizabeth Hartford had stood in the Museum of Modern Art wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant bun, explaining the business strategy of abstract expressionism to a group of donors who'd paid $5,000 each for her private tour. She'd been 27, fresh from Yale with a master's degree in art history, working as a curator to pay off student loans while living in a cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn. James Mitchell had been in the back of the group, 30 years old, 3 months into his tenure as CEO of Sterling Industries after his father's planned retirement. She'd noticed him not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he was actually listening. Most donors came for the tax deduction and the social capital. This man was taking notes. After the tour, he'd approached her. "That was the most interesting analysis I've ever heard. You connected Rothko's color field theory to corporate branding psychology. I've never thought about art that way." She'd been surprised by his genuine interest. "Most people find my tours too academic. I find them brilliant. I'm James Mitchell." "I know who you are. Sterling Industries just acquired MedTech Solutions for $800 million. Bold move for someone who just became CEO." He'd smiled, clearly pleased that she followed business news. "You know your corporate transactions. My family is Hartford Financial. I grew up reading annual reports as bedtime stories." They'd talked for 3 hours in the museum cafe long after the other donors had left. James had been charming and ambitious, full of plans to transform his father's regional company into a national powerhouse. Elizabeth had been drawn to his vision, his energy, his apparent belief that she was more than just a pretty face with the right last name. He needed what she represented. The Hartford name opened doors that new money couldn't access, no matter how many billions it accumulated. She'd thought she needed what he offered: partnership with someone who saw her intelligence, not just her pedigree. They'd married a year later. The New York Times wedding announcement called it a merger of Titan Sterling Industries' innovative new leadership meets Hartford Financial's century-old legacy. But James had made a fundamental error. He'd married Elizabeth for her last name, assuming the name was all she had to offer. He'd never looked past the pedigree to see the brilliant systems thinker, the coder who could build infrastructure from the ground up, the strategist who understood corporate architecture at a level that would have made her invaluable if he'd ever bothered to look. By the time he realized his mistake, it was far too late. At 4 p.m. on the day of the gala, in the presidential suite of the St. Regis Hotel, Rebecca Stone stood before a full-length mirror fastening diamond earrings that cost more than most people's annual salary. Her crimson Versace gown fit like it had been painted on because it had been custom designed to do exactly that. Her dark hair fell in calculated waves that had required 2 hours in a salon chair. Her makeup was flawless, her expression serene. She wasn't dressing for a gala, she was dressing for war. Christopher Hayes, her lead attorney, stood behind her with a tablet scrolling through final contract details. "The merger documents are ready for signature, Ms. Stone. Once you both sign on stage tonight, the deal is official." Rebecca smiled at her reflection. "Once James signs, you mean? I signed this morning. I want him to see that I committed first. It makes it more intimate." Christopher shifted uncomfortably. He'd worked for Rebecca long enough to recognize the edge in her voice, the particular quality of satisfaction that meant someone was about to be destroyed. "Ma'am, about the plan after the announcement. The kiss." Rebecca turned from the mirror, her smile widening. "Yes, Christopher. We've been through this. It's necessary." 15 years ago, Rebecca Stone had been a scholarship student at Stanford, the daughter of an Irish immigrant mechanic from Queens working 3 jobs to afford textbooks. James Mitchell had been another scholarship student, though his family owned a small medical supply business that made him marginally less desperate than Rebecca. They'd met the first day of freshman year, 2 hungry kids who wanted to prove they belonged in a world of trust fund babies and legacy admissions. The chemistry had been instant. They studied together, built startup concepts together, dreamed together about the empire they'd create after graduation. Junior year, lying in the narrow bed of room 407, James had pulled her close and whispered promises. "When we graduate, we're going to build something together. You and me. Nothing will stop us." Rebecca had believed him. Senior year, spring semester, James had attended a charity fundraiser in San Francisco. He'd come back to campus, different, distracted, distant. 3 days later, he'd sat her down in the same cafe where they'd had their first date and delivered the killing blow. "I met someone. Her family is Hartford Financial. Do you understand what that means? That's the kind of connection that opens every door I'll ever need." Rebecca had felt something break inside her chest. "What about us? What about our plans?" "You're brilliant, Rebecca. You'll be successful on your own. But I need to think strategically about the empire I want to build. Elizabeth Hartford is the foundation I need." The subtext was clear. You're poor and she's rich. You're nobody and she's American royalty. You were good enough for college, but not for the real world. Rebecca hadn't cried. Not in front of him. She'd simply said, "Get out," and watched him leave. She'd cried later alone in room 407, staring at the ceiling where they'd mapped out their future together. The crying had lasted 3 days. Then it had calcified into something harder, colder, infinitely more useful. Rage. For 10 years, Rebecca Stone had built Phoenix Innovations with a singular focus. Every late-night coding, every rejected pitch to investors, every closed door and dismissive meeting, every time someone called her difficult or aggressive or too ambitious. All of it had been fuel for one purpose: build an empire large enough to destroy James Mitchell. Not quickly, not emotionally, professionally, thoroughly, with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The merger wasn't a business opportunity. It was the culmination of a decade of planning. Christopher reviewed the timeline on his tablet. Phase 1, 18 months of strategic positioning complete. You've established Phoenix as a serious competitor, created urgency around the merger, made him believe it was his idea. Check. Phase 2, seduction through nostalgia, complete. You've reminded him of Stanford, made him feel like he's reclaiming his youth, positioned yourself as the partner who understands his vision better than anyone. Including his wife. Rebecca's smile was cold. Especially his wife. Phase 3 is tonight. Public announcement at the highest profile event of the social season. Maximum media coverage. And then, the kiss. Rebecca examined her reflection one final time. In the moment of triumph, with every camera in New York pointed at us, James won't be able to resist. His ego won't let him. He'll kiss me in front of his pregnant wife, in front of 1,000 witnesses, in front of God and the world. It will be on every news channel by midnight. Christopher looked uncomfortable. And you're certain he'll do it, that he won't? I know him better than his wife does, better than he knows himself. Rebecca's voice carried absolute certainty. When the applause is thundering and the lights are blazing and everything he's dreamed of is right there in his hands, he'll forget everything else. He'll forget the woman carrying his child. He'll forget his father's warnings. He'll only see this moment, and he won't be able to resist claiming it completely. And after his pregnant wife's humiliation becomes a scandal, the board loses faith in his judgment. Sterling stock crashes from the leadership crisis. My shell corporations short the stock, we profit on the fall. Then we initiate the leveraged buyout while he's drowning in chaos, use Sterling's own assets as collateral, and Phoenix absorbs everything he's built. Rebecca picked up her clutch, checking that it contained nothing but the essentials. James Mitchell chose Elizabeth Hartford's money over me, so I'm going to take his money, his company, his reputation, and his future. He'll have nothing left but the wife he humiliated and the father he disappointed. The merger wasn't business, it was poetry. 6 days before the gala, Elizabeth had sat in the downtown Manhattan offices of Hartford and Associates across from her uncle, Robert Hartford III. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a building in the financial district, wood-paneled and traditional, unchanged since her grandfather had founded it 70 years ago. Uncle Robert had looked troubled as he reviewed the documents she'd requested. "Elizabeth, are you certain about this divorce? With the prenuptial agreement you signed means you'll get the standard settlement, generous but nowhere near half of James's net worth." "I'm not here for the settlement. I need to understand the Hartford family trust." Robert had blinked. "The trust your grandfather established when you married James?" "Yes. Grandfather Hartford transferred 12% of Sterling Industries shares into trust for me to cement the alliance between our families. I need to know the exact terms." Robert had pulled out the trust documents, yellowed slightly despite being only 6 years old. As he read, his eyes had widened with something that looked like recognition. "Elizabeth, there's a clause here I'd honestly forgotten. Your grandfather was remarkably prescient," and he'd turned the document so she could see, pointing to Section 7, subsection C. "If the marriage ends due to adultery committed by James Mitchell, an additional 5% of shares automatically transfer to you from the Hartford-Sterling marriage merger pool. These shares were held in reserve, technically owned by both families, jointly meant to pass to your children. But the adultery clause triggers immediate transfer to you personally." Elizabeth had read the clause 3 times, her grandfather's foresight suddenly clear. He'd known that new money men sometimes forgot who helped them rise. He'd built in insurance. "So if I file for divorce citing adultery, I don't control 12% of Sterling Industries. I control 17%. And William Mitchell controls 19% of the company he founded." Robert had done the math instantly. "That's 36%. More than enough to overrule James on any major board decision. More than enough to remove him as CEO if you can get a simple majority of the remaining board members." Elizabeth had felt the pieces falling into place with crystalline clarity. "Uncle Robert, I need you to prepare divorce papers dated today. Grounds adultery. But don't file them yet. I'll tell you exactly when." "When will that be?" "When the whole world sees what I already know." At 5 p.m., James had emerged from the bedroom of the penthouse looking like a vision from a magazine editorial. The Tom Ford tuxedo fit perfectly. Elizabeth had taken him to the fitting herself 4 months ago, back when she'd still believed in the theater of their marriage. His cufflinks were platinum, engraved with the Sterling Industries logo. Everything about him projected power, success, the absolute confidence of a man at the peak of his abilities. He'd barely looked at her. "You're not ready yet." Almost. He'd checked the Patek Philippe, the watch she'd given him, the watch he wore without thinking about where it came from or what it meant. "Rebecca's team wants me at the plaza by 7 for press photos. My driver will take you separately at 7:30. I'm riding with William." The flash of irritation had been brief but visible. "Why would you do that?" "Your father asked me to arrive with him. He's been acting strange." "Has he said anything?" The question was casual, but Elizabeth heard the anxiety underneath. James had always needed William's approval, even as he chafed against it, even as he tried to prove he'd surpassed the man who built everything James had inherited. "He's worried about you. Worried that I'm finally succeeding beyond his achievements." The bitterness came through sharp and undisguised. "He built a regional company. I'm creating a national infrastructure integrated with AI technology that will change the entire industry. If he can't see the difference, he's worried you're forgetting what actually matters." James had laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Tonight I announced the biggest tech merger in 5 years. I know exactly what matters." He'd walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "The silver Valentino looks good on you. Don't be late. Announcement is at 10 sharp. William Mitchell had arrived at the penthouse in his vintage Bentley, driven by the same chauffeur who'd worked for him for 30 years. He wore his tuxedo with the ease of a man who'd attended 1,000 such events, but his face showed strain Elizabeth had never seen before. When she opened the door, he'd looked at her with something approaching grief. "You look beautiful, my dear, just like Margaret would have looked." Margaret, William's wife, James's mother, dead 10 years from pancreatic cancer. Elizabeth had only known her through photographs and William's stories, but she understood she was receiving the highest compliment the old man could give. "Thank you, William. Are you ready for tonight?" Elizabeth's hand had gone to her belly, instinctively, protectively. "Are we doing the right thing, letting him walk into this?" William had taken her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I tried to warn him. He wouldn't listen. Sometimes a man has to fall before he learns to watch where he's stepping. But we won't let him destroy everything. We'll save the company. We'll save your son's inheritance. And if there's anything left of the man I raised after tonight, maybe he'll find his way back to who he was supposed to be. And if there isn't, then you'll build something better without him." The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales were sponsored by Fortune 500 companies and attended by people who considered a $1,000 ticket a rounding error. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars. 1,000 guests in tuxedos and gowns filled the space with the murmur of power recognizing itself. The press section held 50 photographers and camera crews, all waiting for the announcement everyone knew was coming. At 7:35, James Mitchell and Rebecca Stone had arrived together. The reaction had been immediate and electric. Photographers had surged forward, cameras flashing in a sustained storm of light. James in his perfect tuxedo, Rebecca in crimson Versace that made her look like danger personified. They'd walked the red carpet like they owned not just the event, but the city, the industry, the future itself. "James, Rebecca, over here. Is it true the merger creates a $50 billion company?" Rebecca looked left. "James, what does this mean for Sterling Industries?" James had smiled with perfect confidence, the smile of a man who'd never failed at anything that mattered. "You'll have to wait for our announcement at 10. Rebecca had placed her hand on his arm, looking up at him with an expression of such perfect adoration that Elizabeth, watching on the television in William's Bentley, had felt physically sick. The performance was flawless. Rebecca Stone was good at this. Inside the ballroom, whispers had spread like contagion. "Did you see them? The chemistry is incredible. Where's his wife? I heard she's 8 months pregnant. This is going to be the story of the year." At 7:55, Elizabeth and William had arrived. The photographers had been confused. Mrs. Mitchell wasn't with her husband. She was arriving with her father-in-law. What did that mean? Elizabeth had stepped from the Bentley in her silver Valentino, her pregnancy impossible to hide and not trying to hide it. William had offered his arm and she'd taken it, the patriarch and the pregnant wife presenting a united front that contradicted every expectation. "Mrs. Mitchell, where's James? Are you and Mr. Mitchell arriving separately? Is everything okay with the marriage?" Elizabeth had smiled graciously, her voice carrying just enough volume for the cameras to catch. "My father-in-law and I wanted to arrive together. Family is important tonight. The answer had been deliberately vague, loaded with implications that would spawn a dozen think pieces by morning. The press had sensed blood in the water. Inside the ballroom, Elizabeth and William hadn't gone to table 1 where James and Rebecca sat like visiting royalty. They'd gone to table 3, still VIP, still visible, but positioned directly below the stage in a spot that would be impossible to ignore once the announcement began. Board members had noticed immediately. Kenneth Chen had leaned toward Sandra Morrison, whispering behind his hand, "Why isn't she sitting with her husband? And why is William sitting with her instead of at the head table?" The whole room had begun to sense that something was wrong with the evening's carefully staged narrative. This wasn't how corporate events were supposed to unfold. Between 8 and 9:45, the tension had built like atmospheric pressure before a storm. James had texted Elizabeth, "Why aren't you at our table?" No response. "Is Dad angry about something? Why are you sitting with him?" No response. He'd started to look uncomfortable, his confidence finally showing hairline cracks. Rebecca had noticed. "Something wrong? My wife and father are acting strange." Rebecca had smiled, a private expression of satisfaction she hid from him. Division in the family was exactly what she needed. "Maybe they're just giving you space for your big moment. Don't let it distract you. In an hour, we announce the future." From table 3, Elizabeth had watched James on stage during the sound check, practicing his remarks with Rebecca beside him. She'd seen the way he looked at that woman, the animation in his face, the ease in his body language, the version of himself he became in her presence, younger, sharper, more alive. William had leaned close, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Are you all right?" "No, but I will be." At 9:50, the master of ceremonies had taken the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, in 10 minutes, we have a very special announcement that will reshape the healthcare technology industry. But first, let me remind you why we're here. The Starlight Children's Foundation has raised $12 million tonight for pediatric cancer research. Let's give ourselves a round of applause." Applause polite and perfunctory. Nobody cared about the nominal reason for the gala. Everyone was waiting for the main event. Elizabeth's phone had vibrated. "Uncle Robert. Divorce papers are prepared and dated, ready to file on your signal." She'd typed back, "Stand by." William had leaned close one more time. "Whatever happens in the next hour, remember who you are. You're stronger than my son ever knew. Show them." At exactly 10 p.m., the master of ceremonies had returned to the microphone, his voice dropping into the cadence of an introduction that had clearly been rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce two of the technology world's greatest visionaries. Please welcome to the stage James Mitchell, CEO of Sterling Industries, and Rebecca Stone, CEO of Phoenix Innovations." The applause had been thunderous. Spotlights had blazed. James and Rebecca had walked to the podium together, the absolute embodiment of power coupling, and Elizabeth had thought, "This is the moment. Everything hinges on what happens in the next 5 minutes." James had spoken first, his voice carrying the resonance of a man who'd been born for this kind of moment. "5 years ago, I stood in front of this foundation and pledged that Sterling Industries would revolutionize healthcare logistics. Tonight, I'm here to tell you we didn't just meet that goal. We're about to shatter it." Pause for effect. He'd always had good timing. Rebecca Stone built Phoenix Innovations on a simple but revolutionary idea. Artificial intelligence can predict medical supply needs before hospitals even know they need them. Sterling Industries built the fastest, most reliable distribution network in North America. Separately, we're leaders. Together. He'd turned to Rebecca, and even from table 3, Elizabeth could see the light in his eyes. "We're unstoppable." Rebecca had taken the microphone, her voice like silk wrapped around a blade. "James Mitchell sees not what is, but what could be. 5 years ago, I watched his company transform an industry. I thought that's the kind of vision I want to partner with. Not to compete against, to build with." She'd looked at James, her expression perfect admiration, respect, something that could pass for love if you didn't know better. "In that vision, I found not just a partner, but someone who challenges me to be better every single day. Someone who understands that true innovation requires courage." The room had gone completely silent, 1,000 people holding their breath. James had taken her hand, the gesture natural and possessive. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to announce, effective immediately, Sterling Industries and Phoenix Innovations are merging. We are now one." The ballroom had exploded. Applause like thunder. Camera flashes like lightning. The jumbotrons on either side of the stage had shown James and Rebecca in perfect high definition, 10 feet tall, victorious, and beautiful. Stock tickers at the bottom of the screens had already started moving after-hours trading, responding instantly to the news. Journalists had started typing frantically, racing to be first with the story. This was James Mitchell's coronation, the moment he'd been building toward his entire career. And then in the center of that triumph, with 1,000 eyes watching and 100 cameras recording, he'd forgotten everything else. Rebecca had leaned in, lips slightly parted. James had lowered his head. Their mouths had met in a kiss that was not gentle, not brief, not appropriate for a business announcement. It was deep, passionate, loaded with history and heat and everything a pregnant wife watching from the audience would recognize as absolute betrayal. The jumbotrons had broadcasted in perfect detail. 10 feet tall, impossible to miss, impossible to misinterpret. The applause had faltered, replaced by gasps and sharp intakes of breath. "Oh my God! His wife is here. Are they? Did you see?" The cameras had pivoted frantically, searching the audience for Mrs. Mitchell's reaction for the scandal within the scandal. For 5 seconds, James and Rebecca had been lost in their moment, the center of their own universe, unaware that the world had shifted beneath them. Then Rebecca had pulled back, whispering something in his ear, too quiet for the microphones, and the spell had broken. James had straightened, suddenly aware of the changed atmosphere, the quality of the silence that had replaced the applause. At table 3, Elizabeth had felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting for her to cry, waiting for her to run, waiting for her to collapse under the weight of public humiliation. What would you do in this moment, when the whole world just watched your husband betray you on live television? Would you run? Would you cry? Or would you make sure everyone remembered your name? William's hand had settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Show them your strength." Elizabeth had stood slowly, gracefully, 8 months pregnant in silver Valentino, and taken William's offered arm. They'd begun to walk not toward the exit, not fleeing the scene of the crime, but toward the stage. The movement had cut through the chaos like a knife. People had noticed then, more people, then everyone. The pregnant wife and the patriarch walking with terrible purpose through a parting crowd. Photographers had pivoted cameras, swinging away from the stage to capture this new development. Suddenly, James and Rebecca weren't the story. The story was the woman they'd humiliated walking toward them with her head high and the founder of Sterling Industries at her side. On stage, James had finally understood that something was very wrong. The applause had died. The crowd's attention had shifted. He'd followed their collective gaze and seen his nightmare manifested, Elizabeth and his father walking toward the stage with the gravity of judgment itself. Elizabeth and William had stopped directly in front of the stage, looking up at James and Rebecca with expressions of absolute finality. William had spoken, his voice not raised, but carrying with perfect clarity through the now silent ballroom. "You have disgraced our family name. You have humiliated your wife, who is carrying your son, and you have betrayed every principle your mother taught you." 1,000 people had held their breath. James had tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Father, this isn't—" "No." William had cut him off with the authority of a man who'd built an empire and knew exactly how much power he still held. "You will leave this stage. You will go home. You will wait for me there. Do you understand?" It was an order, not a request. James Mitchell, billionaire, CEO, master of the universe, had suddenly been reduced to a child being disciplined by his father. William had turned to Elizabeth, his voice softening. "Let me take you home, my dear." Before leaving, Elizabeth had looked up at James one last time, not with hatred that would have been easier for him to process, not with tears that would have confirmed his narrative that she was weak, with pity, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already moved past him into a future he couldn't imagine. Then she turned and walked away, William's hand steady on her arm. The moment they'd exited the ballroom had erupted into chaos. Phones everywhere, recording, photographing, tweeting, texting. The story, metastasizing in real time, spreading across social media faster than any PR team could hope to contain. Did you see that? The wife just walked out with the founder. This is insane. Sterling stock is going to crash. Somebody get this to Bloomberg. I'm calling my broker right now. On stage, James had stood frozen, the spotlight harsh and unforgiving. The jumbotrons had split-screened his face with replays of the kiss, creating a loop of his betrayal that would be memed and shared and analyzed for weeks. Rebecca had recovered first, her expression shifting to cool professionalism. Well, that was more dramatic than expected. She'd turned to James, her voice carrying just enough sympathy to sound convincing to the cameras. This is a family matter. I think I should give you space. She'd walked off stage with perfect poise, leaving James completely alone in the spotlight, abandoned by everyone who'd been on that stage with him moments before. He'd pulled out his phone with shaking hands, called Elizabeth voicemail, called William. The call hadn't even rung, just gone straight to a message that the number was unavailable. Blocked. He'd walked off stage to absolute silence. Nobody approached him. Nobody made eye contact. He was toxic now, radioactive with scandal. The king had been dethroned in front of his entire kingdom, and he didn't even know that the worst was yet to come. The penthouse was dark when James arrived at 11:30. Manhattan spread below him like a galaxy of indifferent light, each window a life continuing without awareness of his collapse. He dropped his keys on the marble console, the sound echoing through rooms that suddenly felt cavernous. Elizabeth. Silence answered. He moved through the space like a ghost haunting his own life. The living room showed no signs of disturbance. The kitchen was pristine. But when he reached the bedroom, he understood. Dresser drawers hung open, empty. The closet where Elizabeth's dresses had hung in organized rows now showed gaps like missing teeth. Her jewelry box gone. The photographs from their wedding that had stood on her nightstand gone. Even her prescription bottles had been cleared from the bathroom. On the bed, centered with deliberate precision, lay a single sheet of paper. Petition for divorce. Elizabeth Hartford, Mitchell versus James Andrew. Mitchell, grounds adultery, filed 7 days prior. James's hands shook as he read the date. 7 days. She'd known or suspected enough to prepare legal documents a full week before tonight. The kiss wasn't the betrayal that destroyed her. It was the confirmation, the public evidence that triggered a plan already in motion. His phone rang. Rebecca. James, we need damage control. My PR team can spin this as the merger documents. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. Hollow. Section 14.3, the Restructuring Authority Clause. I need to review it again. James, it's midnight. You've had a traumatic evening. Get some sleep. We'll regroup tomorrow and... No, I need to understand the exact language. If there's a CEO transition or leadership crisis, who controls asset reallocation during integration? Rebecca's pause lasted 3 seconds too long. The lawyers approved everything. Your team, my team. It's standard integration language. If you're trying to back out now, Sterling Industries will look unstable. The stock will crash. Is that what you want? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he was only beginning to process. Get some rest. Rebecca continued, her voice softening into something that might have been concern. Tomorrow we move forward. Together. She disconnected. James sat on the bed, divorce papers in one hand, phone in the other, and felt the architecture of his certainty begin to crack. He'd been played by Rebecca, abandoned by his wife, blocked by his father, and he'd done it all to himself, walking into every trap with his eyes wide open because his ego had made him blind. How often do we mistake silence for weakness? How often do we underestimate the people who love us most until it's too late? At 1 a.m, 60 miles north in Greenwich, Connecticut, Elizabeth sat in the library of William's estate. The room smelled of old leather and older wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding first editions and family histories. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, unnecessary for warmth but necessary for something else, some atavistic need for light in the darkness. William poured her sparkling water in a crystal glass. No alcohol, she was still carrying Daniel. The name had come to her during the car ride from the city, solid and traditional, honoring her grandfather Hartford without completely erasing James from their son's identity. "How do you feel?" Elizabeth's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "Like I just detonated my life in front of 1,000 people. You saved your life. And your son's future." William settled into the leather chair across from her, looking every one of his 68 years. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., emergency board meeting. I've already sent the notifications. We expose Rebecca's scheme and remove James before he can do more damage. He won't believe it. Not coming from us. Then we'll make sure the evidence speaks for itself." William opened the thick file folder he'd been carrying, spreading documents across the mahogany desk. "This is everything. 3 months of investigation into Rebecca Stone compiled by Kroll Associates. We're going to walk the board through exactly how close Sterling Industries came to being devoured." Elizabeth leaned forward, studying the architecture of Rebecca's betrayal laid out in financial diagrams and surveillance photos. The sophistication was breathtaking. Shell corporations nested within holding companies' offshore accounts, routing through 3 jurisdictions, every transaction designed to be technically legal while building toward catastrophic fraud. "She's been planning this since Stanford," William continued. "The investigator found her old roommate woman, named Catherine Liu, still lives in Palo Alto, works for Google now. She remembers Rebecca, after the breakup, saying she'd make James Mitchell regret choosing a last name over a partner. Catherine thought it was just heartbreak talking. Rebecca meant every word." "How did you know to investigate her?" William's face showed the particular pain of a parent watching their child make destructive choices. "I showed James the preliminary findings 10 days ago. Not all of this, we didn't have the email evidence yet or the complete financial architecture. But enough. The shell corporations with Stanford references. The surveillance operation. I begged him to delay the merger to let us investigate further before committing to anything." "What did he say?" The old man's voice cracked slightly. "That I was jealous of his success. That I couldn't accept him surpassing my achievements. That I was a sentimentalist who didn't understand modern business practices. He said I was trying to sabotage him because I'd always favored you over him as my successor." William looked away, blinking rapidly. He chose to believe a woman he hadn't seen in 10 years over the father who built everything he inherited. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe, for the family they'd been before ambition poisoned it. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You didn't create this mess. You're just the one cleaning it up." William pushed a separate document toward her. "This is the Hartford Family Trust Agreement. Tell me about Section 7, subsection C." She'd memorized the language during her meeting with Uncle Robert. "If the marriage ends due to James's adultery, an additional 5% of Sterling shares transfer to me from the marriage merger reserve, combined with my existing 12% that gives me 17% total ownership. And I control 19% as founder and chairman emeritus." William's calculation was instant. 36%. Enough to overrule James on any major decision, enough to remove him as CEO with just a simple majority of remaining board members. "He'll fight us. Let him try. The evidence is overwhelming. Rebecca's bribed board members, Kenneth Chen and Sandra Morrison, will be exposed and removed. The merger terms will be revealed as a trap, and James's judgment will be proven catastrophically flawed." William leaned back, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "The question is, what happens to him after?" Elizabeth understood what he was asking. She had the power to exile James completely, to erase him from the company and their son's life. Or she could offer something else, a narrow path to redemption that he'd have to earn through years of work. "I'm not merciful," she heard herself say, "but I am strategic. A broken, exiled James becomes a victim. People pity. A James who helps save the company becomes a man who learned from his mistakes. I want Daniel to have a father he can respect, even if I can't have a husband I can trust." William nodded slowly. "You're wiser than my son ever gave you credit for. I had to be. Nobody was paying attention. And in that moment, in that fire-lit library, Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell stopped being the quiet wife who was underestimated. She became the strategist who would save an empire. Not because she was cruel, not because she wanted revenge, but because she understood something James had forgotten. Real power doesn't announce itself. It prepares, it waits, and it strikes only when victory is certain. Across town in the St. Regis presidential suite, Rebecca Stone stood before 5 television screens, each tuned to a different news channel. The coverage was universal and damning. CNN, Sterling Industries CEO caught in passionate embrace with merger partner while pregnant wife watches from audience. Questions arise about corporate governance and leadership stability. CNBC, Sterling stock expected to open sharply lower on leadership crisis concerns. CEO, James Mitchell's personal conduct raises fiduciary duty questions. Bloomberg, William Mitchell, Sterling Industries founder, publicly rebukes son at charity gala. Emergency board meeting rumored for tomorrow morning. Fox Business, tech merger announcement overshadowed by scandal. Phoenix Innovations, CEO, Rebecca Stone declines comment on viral kiss with married business partner. MSNBC, pregnant wife walks out with company founder in dramatic confrontation. Social media erupts with speculation about Sterling Industries' future. This wasn't the narrative Rebecca had architected. The story should have been about the historic merger, the creation of a new tech powerhouse, the brilliant partnership between 2 visionary CEOs. Instead, it was about scandal, betrayal, family drama. The kiss was supposed to humiliate Elizabeth privately while publicly cementing Rebecca's position as James's true partner. It was supposed to destabilize his marriage quietly while the business merger proceeded smoothly. Then, once the crisis hit and Sterling stock crashed, Rebecca would be positioned as the stable force, the professional who could navigate chaos while James drowned in personal turmoil. But William Mitchell's public intervention had hijacked the narrative completely. Now the story was about a father protecting his pregnant daughter-in-law from his son's recklessness. Elizabeth had gone from victim to protagonist. Rebecca had been cast as the predatory other woman instead of the brilliant CEO. Christopher Hayes entered the suite, his tablet showing real-time social media analytics. "Ma'am, we have a problem." "I can see the problem on 5 different screens." "No, a different problem. Our contact at Cayman National Bank called 20 minutes ago. Someone's been tracing our shell corporations. Very sophisticated financial forensics started approximately 48 hours ago. They're following the money trails we established for the short-selling operation." Rebecca turned from the screens, her expression hardening. Who? Unknown. But whoever's conducting the investigation has serious resources and expertise. They're not just looking at the surface structures. They're going deep, tracing beneficial ownership through multiple layers. The implications crystallized instantly. This wasn't random due diligence. Someone had specifically targeted her offshore architecture, someone who knew what to look for and how to find it. "William Mitchell," Rebecca said quietly. "That old man has been investigating me." Christopher consulted his tablet. It would explain the timeline. If he started when James first mentioned the merger 3 months ago, he'd have everything: the shell corporations, the bribed board members, the real merger terms. Rebecca's mind raced through scenarios and countermeasures. If they trace the shells back before we can execute the buyout, we're exposed for securities fraud and market manipulation. I could go to prison. Should we abort, dissolve the entities, move the money, cancel the operation? Rebecca walked to the window, looking down at Fifth Avenue, 40 stories below. Headlights streamed through the darkness like blood flowing through arteries. She'd spent 10 years building Phoenix Innovations specifically to destroy James Mitchell. She'd orchestrated every move of this campaign with surgical precision. She was 3 moves from checkmate, and William Mitchell had apparently been playing a deeper game the entire time. "No." Her voice carried the steel of absolute conviction. "We accelerate. Tomorrow morning we start the short positions regardless of the investigation timeline. We force the buyout before they can build a prosecutable case. Speed becomes our defense. Ma'am, that's incredibly risky. If the SEC, I didn't build a billion-dollar company by being cautious, Christopher. Tomorrow we go to war. If William Mitchell wants to investigate me, he can do it while I'm buying his company out from under his son. At 6 in the morning, James woke on top of the bed, still wearing his tuxedo, the divorce papers crumpled beneath him. He'd spent the night reviewing merger documents on his laptop, and what he'd found had turned his blood to ice. Clause 14. 3. In event of CEO transition or leadership instability, Phoenix Innovations retains unilateral restructuring authority over combined entity assets for duration of 90-day integration period. Translation: if James got removed as CEO, which the scandal would certainly provoke, Rebecca could restructure everything, move assets, reallocate resources, effectively control Sterling Industries while maintaining the fiction of a merger. Clause 22. 7. Asset reallocation may occur without shareholder approval during integration period if deemed operationally necessary by Phoenix leadership. Translation: Rebecca could strip Sterling's assets without asking permission. Clause 31.4. Sterling Industries' intellectual property portfolio, including all patents, proprietary software, and trade secrets, shall be transferred to NewCo within 30 days of merger close. Translation: Elizabeth's logistics system, every innovation Sterling had developed, every competitive advantage, all transferred to a company Rebecca would control. His lawyers had approved this. The board had approved this. He'd approved this too, focused on the vision of a combined empire to read the fine print that would cost him everything. The doorbell rang. A courier stood in the hallway holding a package. Inside, a handwritten letter and a USB drive. James, you were my husband. You are my son's father. Those facts don't change even if our marriage is over. You made catastrophic mistakes, but you're not the only victim of Rebecca Stone's scheme. The USB drive contains evidence that she's been manipulating you for years. This doesn't excuse your choices, but it provides context. Today at 8 a.m. there will be an emergency board meeting. William and I are moving to protect Sterling Industries from a hostile takeover disguised as a merger. You can attend or you can stay away. If you attend, you will see the truth about Rebecca. You will see what your father tried to warn you about. And you will have a choice: help us save the company or watch it burn. If you choose to help, you will work under my leadership. You will follow William's guidance. You will be supervised and limited. But it will be a role. And if you succeed, you will earn the right to be a father to your son, not as my husband, but as a man he can respect. You have 1 hour to decide. Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell, interim, CEO, pending board approval. James inserted the USB drive with shaking hands. What he saw in the next 30 minutes shattered every assumption he'd built his recent decisions on. Surveillance photos of himself at the gym, the coffee shop, leaving the office, 18 months of documentation showing Rebecca had tracked his every movement. Email transcripts proving she'd bribed Kenneth Chen and Sandra Morrison. Financial diagrams laying out the leveraged buyout scheme. Recorded phone calls between Rebecca and her financial advisors discussing the timeline for shorting Sterling stock after the merger announcement. And at the bottom of the drive, a video file labeled Stanford_2001_final_conversation.mp4. He clicked it. The video was grainy, clearly recorded on someone's phone and enhanced later. But the audio was clear enough. Rebecca's voice. Once Sterling's stock crashes from the leadership crisis, we'll have full control. James will be ruined personally and professionally. That's the point. Male voice, presumably Christopher Hayes. And you're certain this is worth the legal risk? Rebecca, this isn't just business. He chose that Hartford princess over me 10 years ago. He used me as a stepping stone at Stanford and threw me away when someone shinier came along. Now I'm using him as a foundation to build my empire on. Poetic justice. The video ended. James sat in darkness, understanding finally complete. Rebecca had never wanted partnership. She'd wanted destruction dressed up as reunion. Every meeting, every flirtation, every reminder of their Stanford days, all of it had been manipulation toward a single goal: his total annihilation. The woman he'd thought was his equal was his executioner. The wife he'd thought was weak had been protecting him. The father he'd thought was jealous had been trying to save him. At 7:30, James showered, shaved, and put on his most conservative suit, not the power suit he wore to intimidate, but the humble navy that suggested contrition. At 7:45, he called his driver and headed to Sterling Industries headquarters. The boardroom occupied the entire 80th floor, glass walls offering panoramic views of Manhattan at dawn. The 30-foot obsidian table could seat 20, but today only 15 chairs were filled. The board members arrived in clusters, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and concern. William Mitchell sat at the head of the table in the chairman's position he'd vacated 5 years ago. His presence was a message the founder had returned because the heir had failed. James arrived at 7:55, his stomach churning. The board members watched him enter with expressions ranging from sympathy to disgust. He took a seat in the middle of the table, not at the head where the CEO traditionally sat, but among the others, diminished. At exactly 8 a.m., the doors opened. Elizabeth entered wearing a navy Armani maternity suit that somehow made her pregnancy look like authority rather than vulnerability. Her hair was pulled into a severe bun. Her face showed no trace of the woman who'd been publicly humiliated 12 hours earlier. She looked like exactly what she was, a Hartford descended from a century of American financial royalty, stepping into a role she'd been born to fill. Behind her came 2 lawyers from Hartford and Associates, and one from Paul Weiss Rifkind Wharton and Garrison, the most feared corporate litigation firm in New York. Board members exchanged glances. This was no ordinary emergency meeting. William called the session to order. Thank you all for coming on short notice. We're here to address a crisis of leadership and a potential fraud that threatens Sterling Industries' existence. Kenneth Chen, CFO and Rebecca's secretly bribed ally, leaned forward defensively. With respect, Mr. Mitchell, the Phoenix merger was approved by this board through proper channels. If you're suggesting there were irregularities, Elizabeth stood. Every eye turned to her. I am Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell. For 5 years I've been silent in this boardroom. Silent while I designed the logistics infrastructure that saves this company $40 million annually. Silent while my husband took credit for systems I built. Silent while I watched him make decisions based on ego rather than evidence. Her voice carried the controlled fury of someone who'd been underestimated too long. I'm done being silent. The lawyers distributed files to each board member. Elizabeth continued as they opened folders and began reading. What you're looking at is a 3-month investigation into Rebecca Stone and Phoenix Innovations conducted by Kroll Associates, the premier corporate intelligence firm. It reveals a conspiracy to commit securities fraud, market manipulation, bribery, and corporate espionage. She pressed a button on the remote control. The wall-mounted screen lit up with an email thread. From Rebecca Stone to Kenneth Chen. Subject: consulting arrangement. Ken. Your retainer with Phoenix will be $500,000 annually effective upon merger close. In return, I need your vote supporting the merger and your vote against James Mitchell if any leadership confidence issues arise. Wire transfer details attached. Kenneth's face drained of color. A second email appeared, this one to Sandra Morrison, with identical language and terms. Sandra looked at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. William's voice cut through the shocked silence. I move for immediate removal of Kenneth Chen and Sandra Morrison from this board for breach of fiduciary duty, acceptance of bribes, and conspiracy to defraud shareholders. Thomas Bradford, the senior independent director, seconded immediately. The vote was 12-2, with only Kenneth and Sandra opposing. Security was already waiting outside. The 2 disgraced board members were escorted from the room, Kenneth protesting about lawyers and wrongful termination, Sandra silent with shame. With the traitors gone, Elizabeth continued the presentation. Second, the shell corporations. A network diagram appeared showing Rebecca's 7 offshore entities, each name highlighted. Sequoia 7 LLC, named for the Stanford dormitory where she and James lived. Palo Alto Holdings, the city of their first date. Room 407 Ventures, their dorm room number. She let that sink in. Rebecca Stone used intimate details from her relationship with James to name the companies she created to destroy him. This wasn't business, it was personal. Surveillance photos appeared next. James at the gym, James at Starbucks, James leaving the office, hundreds of time-stamped images showing 18 months of tracking. Third, corporate espionage. Rebecca hired private investigators to document James's every movement, every pattern, every routine. She knew his schedule better than his own assistant. The merger documents came next, specific clauses highlighted in red. Fourth, the merger trap. These provisions give Phoenix unilateral control over Sterling's assets during a leadership crisis. The kiss last night wasn't spontaneous passion, it was a calculated trigger designed to create exactly that crisis. Once James is removed as CEO, Rebecca can restructure Sterling however she wants. Move assets, strip IP, effectively loot the company while maintaining the legal fiction of a merger. Financial projections appeared showing the short-selling strategy and leveraged buyout timeline. Fifth, the planned attack. Rebecca's shell corporations were positioned to short Sterling stock the moment the leadership scandal drove our price down. She would profit from our collapse, then buy Sterling's assets at fire sale prices using our own balance sheet as collateral. Estimated profit to Rebecca $3 billion. Estimated loss to Sterling shareholders everything. The boardroom sat in stunned silence. Thomas Bradford finally spoke. "This is the most sophisticated corporate fraud I've seen in 40 years. Jennifer Wu, the retail executive, looked stricken. "How did we miss this during merger due diligence?" "Because Rebecca is brilliant," Elizabeth acknowledged. "Every transaction was technically legal on its own. It's only when you see the complete architecture that the fraud becomes obvious. She spent 10 years planning this revenge. She nearly succeeded." James stood, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide. "Everything Elizabeth and my father have presented is true. I spent last night reviewing the evidence. Rebecca Stone manipulated me for months using our history at Stanford to blind me to her real agenda. But that doesn't excuse my choices." He looked around the table at 15 faces showing varying degrees of judgment. "I betrayed my wife. I ignored my father's warnings. I let ego and ambition blind me to red flags a competent CEO should have caught immediately. I signed a merger that would have destroyed this company because I wanted to prove I was smarter than everyone else." His voice cracked. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for a chance to help fix what I broke." William spoke into the heavy silence. "Before we discuss James's role, we need to address his position. I move for a vote of no confidence in James Mitchell as CEO of Sterling Industries, effective immediately." Bradford seconded. Discussion followed, brief and pointed. Some argued James deserved a chance to redeem himself. Others insisted the scandal made him a liability regardless of intentions. The question wasn't whether he'd been manipulated, it was whether shareholders could trust his judgment going forward. The vote was 9-4 in favor of removal. James Andrew Mitchell was no longer CEO of Sterling Industries. William continued without pause. "I nominate Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell as interim CEO, effective immediately." The shock was palpable. Bradford voiced the concern everyone felt. "With respect, Elizabeth has never run a company of this scale. She ran the Hartford Foundation for 6 years, managing a $3 billion endowment with returns that beat the market average by 4% annually. She designed the infrastructure that powers our current competitive advantage. She has more operational acumen than my son demonstrated in his entire tenure." William's voice carried absolute conviction. "And she's not compromised by scandal. When this story hits the media, and it will, the narrative will be clear. The wronged woman rises to save the company her husband nearly destroyed. Shareholders will trust that. Markets will respond positively." Jennifer Wu raised her hand. "I second the nomination." The vote was 10-3 in favor with 2 abstentions. Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell, 8 months pregnant, was now interim CEO of Sterling Industries. She addressed the board with the calm authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. "Here's what we do immediately. First, legal action. We file complaints with the SEC and FBI regarding Rebecca's shell corporations and market manipulation. Paul Weiss has already drafted the submissions. They'll be filed within the hour. Second public disclosure. We go public with the fraud before Rebecca can execute her short-selling strategy. I've scheduled an interview with CNBC at 2 p.m. today. We expose her scheme on live television, we explain why we're canceling the merger, and we demonstrate that Sterling Industries is under stable ethical leadership. Third merger termination. We invoke the material misrepresentation clause in the merger agreement. Rebecca lied about her intentions and concealed conflicts of interest. The contract is void. Our lawyers will deliver notice to Phoenix within 2 hours. Fourth, defensive measures. We implement a poison pill provision, flood the market with new Sterling shares that existing shareholders can buy at a discount. This makes any hostile takeover prohibitively expensive and protects us while the legal process unfolds. Bradford looked impressed, despite himself. What about Phoenix's inevitable retaliation? Elizabeth's smile was cold. Let her try. We have the FBI, the SEC documented evidence, and the truth. She has fraud, bribery, and rapidly disappearing offshore accounts. This isn't a fair fight. She turned to James, and her voice shifted from CEO to something more personal. You said you want to help. Here's how. You know Rebecca better than anyone in this room. You know her patterns, her psychology, her tells. You're going to work as special investigator, reporting directly to William, helping federal authorities build their case. Rebecca still thinks you're her ally. We're going to use that. Feed her false information, predict her moves, help us stay 3 steps ahead until she's in custody. James met her eyes. Whatever it takes. You'll have limited access and supervised activities. If you prove trustworthy over the next 6 months, we'll discuss expanded responsibilities. If you compromise this operation in any way, you're out permanently, and you'll never see your son except in supervised visitation. She paused. Do you understand? I understand. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the chance. Don't thank me. Earn it. The meeting adjourned. Elizabeth had the board's full support and a company to save. At 10 a.m., Rebecca's counterattack began. The Wall Street Journal published a breaking story with a headline designed to maximize damage. Sterling Industries crisis deepens, internal documents show over-leveraged liquidity concerns. The article cited anonymous board sources and quoted from leaked financial documents showing Sterling had borrowed heavily to fund recent expansion. The reporting made normal business leverage sound like impending bankruptcy. Sterling's stock opened at $160, down 18% from the previous close. Within an hour, the company had lost $12 billion in market capitalization. Rebecca called James's cell phone. He let it ring twice before answering, remembering Elizabeth's instructions sound rattled, uncertain, defensive. Rebecca, I just saw the journal piece. This is a disaster. Her voice oozed synthetic sympathy. James, I'm so sorry. My team had nothing to do with that leak. If there's anything Phoenix can do to help stabilize the situation. The board is in chaos. There's talk of delaying the merger until we sort out the financial questions and the personal situation. He let his voice crack slightly, a man overwhelmed. Rebecca's satisfaction came through clearly despite her attempt to hide it. That would be unfortunate, but I understand. These things take time. Keep me posted on developments. I will. And Rebecca, thank you for being patient with this mess. Of course. We're partners now. Partners support each other. He disconnected and immediately texted Elizabeth. She took the bait. Thinks we're in disarray and the merger might still proceed on a delayed timeline. She's planning next moves based on false intelligence. Elizabeth's reply came instantly. Good. Let her think she's winning. Overconfidence will make her sloppy. At noon, FBI agents arrived at Phoenix Innovations headquarters in the financial district with a warrant authorized by a federal judge. They seized computers, file servers, paper records, and the contents of Rebecca's office safe. Employees watched through glass walls as their CEO's empire was systematically dismantled for evidence. Christopher Hayes found Rebecca in her corner office watching the raid unfold. Ma'am, we need to shut down the shell corporations immediately, transfer assets, dissolve entities, eliminate the paper trail before they can... Too late. Rebecca's voice was flat. If we move money now, it proves consciousness of guilt. We sit tight and lawyer up. An FBI agent knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Ms. Stone, I'm Special Agent Marcus Chen. We have questions about offshore accounts registered to entities using names that match your personal history. Sequoia 7, LLC. Palo Alto Holdings. Room 407 Ventures. Can you explain the connection? Rebecca's expression showed nothing. I want my attorney present for any questioning. That's your right. But I should inform you we have full cooperation from Sterling Industries Board of Directors, including detailed financial documentation and witness testimony. Someone built a very thorough case against you, Ms. Stone. William Mitchell, Rebecca said quietly. Agent Chen didn't confirm or deny. You'll need to come with us to answer questions downtown. You can call your lawyer on the way. At 2 p.m., Elizabeth sat in CNBC's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, across from anchor Andrea Mitchell. Behind them, a ticker showed Sterling stock still down 14%. The interview would be broadcast live to millions of viewers and would determine whether Elizabeth could stabilize the bleeding or whether Sterling would continue its death spiral. Andrea opened with the question everyone wanted answered. Miss Mitchell, thank you for joining us during what must be an extraordinarily difficult time. Last night's events at the Starlight Gala have dominated financial news. How do you respond to questions about Sterling Industries' stability? Elizabeth looked directly into the camera, her composure absolute. Andrea, what happened last night was painful on a personal level. But I'm not here to discuss my marriage. I'm here as the newly appointed interim CEO of Sterling Industries to discuss an attempted fraud that nearly destroyed our company. Andrea's surprise was genuine. You're CEO now. As of 8 a.m. this morning, yes. The board voted unanimously to remove James Mitchell and appoint me. Not because of the affair, though, that showed catastrophic judgment, but because we discovered that the Phoenix Innovations merger was a Trojan horse designed to steal our company. On-screen graphics appeared showing the shell corporations, the bribed board members, the surveillance operation, the poisoned merger terms. Elizabeth walked through each element of Rebecca's scheme with prosecutorial precision, presenting evidence that made denial impossible. Rebecca Stone spent 10 years planning to destroy my husband and steal Sterling Industries. She manipulated him using their romantic history from Stanford. She bribed our board members. She created shell corporations to short our stock. She designed merger terms that would have given her control of our assets during a manufactured crisis. Elizabeth's voice carried controlled fury. She very nearly succeeded. Andrea looked genuinely shocked. You're alleging securities fraud on national television? I'm not alleging it. I'm stating it. Sterling Industries has filed complaints with the SEC and FBI. Ms. Stone's offices were raided this morning. We have documented evidence of bribery, market manipulation, and conspiracy. We are canceling the merger effective immediately and implementing defensive measures to protect our shareholders. This is extraordinary. What made you investigate Rebecca Stone? My father-in-law, William Mitchell, the founder of Sterling Industries. 3 months ago, he sensed something wrong about the merger terms and Rebecca's sudden interest in partnering with his son. He hired investigators and built a comprehensive case. He tried to warn James. James chose not to listen. So William and I took action to protect the company our shareholders depend on. The market reaction was immediate. Within minutes of Elizabeth's interview, Sterling stock rebounded 8 points. By closing bell, it was down only 3% from pre-scandal levels, remarkable recovery given the morning's devastation. Phoenix Innovations stock, meanwhile, crashed 35% on fraud allegations. Trading was halted by the NYSE pending investigation. Rebecca Stone's name trended #1 on Twitter, but the narrative had shifted completely. She wasn't the brilliant CEO partnering with James Mitchell. She was the scorned ex-lover who'd orchestrated corporate espionage and fraud. And watching from his temporary apartment in a building he'd moved to because he couldn't face the penthouse, James Mitchell saw his ex-wife do what he should have done, lead with integrity. She wasn't bitter, she wasn't vindictive, she was simply telling the truth. And in that moment he understood why the board chose her. Not because she was wronged, but because she was right. At 4 p.m., FBI agents returned to the St. Regis with an arrest warrant. Rebecca Stone stood in her suite wearing jeans and a simple sweater, the crimson Versace from last night abandoned on the closet floor like a shed skin. Special Agent Chen read her rights. Rebecca Stone, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and market manipulation. The handcuffs clicked closed around her wrists. Photographers outside the hotel captured every moment as she was led through the lobby, the CEO, who'd nearly stolen a $50 billion company now facing federal prosecution. One reporter shouted, "Ms. Stone, do you have anything to say?" Rebecca looked directly into the camera and smiled an expression devoid of remorse or fear. "I built Phoenix from nothing once. I'll rebuild. This isn't over." But it was. Phoenix Innovations filed for bankruptcy protection within a week. Rebecca's assets were frozen. Her bail was set at $10 million. The empire she'd built specifically to destroy James Mitchell collapsed under the weight of her own ambition. For 3 weeks after the arrest, James worked as special investigator, providing detailed testimony to FBI agents and SEC lawyers. He spent 16-hour days reconstructing the timeline of Rebecca's manipulation, identifying red flags he'd missed, offering insights into her psychology that helped prosecutors build their case. He did it without complaint, without demanding recognition, working in a small office 2 floors below the executive suite where he used to hold court. William monitored his progress daily, reporting back to Elizabeth. He's being thorough and humble, taking direction from people who used to report to him, actually listening for once. Elizabeth, working from her office with her hand resting on her 8.5-month belly, nodded. Good. He's learning. But don't mistake cooperation for redemption. That's a much longer road. Are you really never taking him back? William, I loved him. Maybe part of me still does. But trust once shattered, this completely can't be rebuilt to what it was. I'll let him be a father to Daniel. I won't let him be my husband again. Some things break beyond repair. 4 weeks and 3 days after the gala, at 11:45 at night, Elizabeth's water broke. She was in her temporary apartment in Greenwich. She'd refused to return to the Park Avenue penthouse, couldn't bear the weight of memory that place carried. William had converted his guest wing into a comfortable suite for her, close enough to help, but far enough to preserve privacy. The contractions started strong and close together. William drove her to New York Presbyterian Hospital, holding her hand in the back of the Bentley, while his driver navigated empty highways at speeds that would have earned tickets if anyone had been watching. "You're going to be fine," William kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know." "I'm terrified." "That's normal. But you've saved a company in the last month. You can bring your son into the world." In the hospital waiting room, uninvited but present, sat James. William had texted him when Elizabeth went into labor, a courtesy, an acknowledgement that despite everything, this was still his son being born. James had come immediately, though he made no presumption of being allowed in the delivery room. He just sat in the uncomfortable waiting room chair alone, hoping for news. At 12:47 a.m., a nurse emerged. "It's a boy, 8 pounds 6 ounces, healthy and perfect." James stood. "Can I see him?" "Let me check with Mom." Inside the delivery room, Elizabeth held her son against her chest, feeling a love so overwhelming it bordered on physical pain. He was perfect. Dark hair, tiny fists, eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. William stood beside her, tears streaming down his face. "He's beautiful," the old man whispered. "Margaret would have loved him. Should I let James meet him?" William squeezed her hand. "That's your choice, Elizabeth. Only yours." She thought about the man who'd betrayed her, who was working to earn his way back to humanity, who would be connected to her through this child for the rest of their lives. This baby deserved a father. Not the James who'd kissed Rebecca Stone on stage, but maybe the James who was learning slowly and painfully what actually mattered. "Send him in. 5 minutes. Him in." James entered hesitantly, looking diminished in his rumpled clothes, exhausted from weeks of testimony and sleepless nights. He saw Elizabeth holding the baby and stopped, his face crumbling. "Come closer." He approached the bed as if walking on sacred ground, looked down at his son, and broke completely, tears streaming down his face in a way Elizabeth had never seen in their entire marriage. "He's perfect, I don't have words. His name is Daniel William Mitchell. Daniel for my grandfather Hartford. William for your father." James looked at William, who nodded acceptance of the honor. "Would you like to hold him?" James's shock was total. "May I?" Elizabeth transferred the baby to his father's awkward arms. James held Daniel like he was made of glass, staring at the tiny face with wonder and devastation mixing in equal measure. "Daniel, I'm your father," his voice broke, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life earning the right to deserve that title. I'm going to be better, for you." Elizabeth watched this moment with clear eyes. This wasn't reconciliation. This wasn't forgiveness. This was giving her son a chance to know his father, nothing more. "James, you'll see Daniel 3 times a week, supervised at first. William will coordinate the schedule. You'll be a good father or you'll be removed from his life completely. Do you understand?" "I understand. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for this chance." He handed the baby back, kissed Daniel's forehead with infinite gentleness, and left without asking for more. And in that hospital room with her newborn son in her arms, and her ex-husband's tears still hanging in the air, Elizabeth Hartford. Mitchell understood something profound. Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing what to rebuild and what to let go. She could give Daniel a father. She couldn't give James another chance. And she was finally at peace with that. The call came at 11:45 p.m., pulling James from the worst night of his life into something worse. William's voice on the phone. "Elizabeth's in labor, New York Presbyterian. I'm with her now." James had been sitting in the dark of his temporary apartment, a furnished rental in Midtown, anonymous and soulless, staring at his phone for the past 3 hours, watching his life disintegrate in real time across social media, watching the stock price crater, watching his name become a punchline. But the baby, his son, that cut through everything else. "I'm coming. You'll wait in the visitors area. She doesn't want you in the delivery room." The words landed like blows, each one precise. "I understand." He'd thrown on clothes and taken a cab to the hospital, arriving at 12:15 to find the labor and delivery floor. Quiet, dim, the fluorescent lights turned low for night. A nurse had directed him to a waiting room with vinyl chairs and magazines from 6 months ago. He'd sat down and put his head in his hands. 3 floors above him, Elizabeth Hartford Mitchell was bringing their son into the world, and he wasn't allowed to be there for it. This was his punishment. This was what he deserved. The hours had crawled past. 12:30, 1 a.m., 1:15. Every minute felt like testimony to everything he'd destroyed. At 12:47, a baby's cry had pierced through the closed doors, faint but unmistakable. James had stood up, his heart hammering, every instinct screaming to go to her, to see his son, to be part of this moment that could never come again. He'd forced himself to stay in the waiting room. She'd been clear. He wasn't welcome. 20 minutes later, a nurse had emerged, her expression professionally neutral. "It's a boy, 8 pounds 6 ounces, healthy and perfect." James had felt something crack open in his chest. May I see him?" "Let me ask the mother." She'd disappeared back through the doors. James had stood in the empty waiting room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, linoleum floor, spotless and cold, and understood with absolute clarity that his presence at his son's birth was a privilege he had to beg for. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He'd started to think the answer was no, that this was another door closed against him, another consequence he'd have to accept. Then the nurse had reappeared. 5 minutes. Mom's exhausted and she needs rest. Don't upset her." James had followed her through the maze of corridors to a recovery room at the end of the hall. The door had been partially open. He'd pushed it wider and stopped, frozen by what he saw. Elizabeth sat propped up in the hospital bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale with exhaustion but transformed by something James had never seen before. She held a tiny bundle against her chest, the baby's face barely visible beneath the blue hospital blanket. William stood beside the bed, one hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, looking down at his grandson with an expression of such profound tenderness that James felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. The tableau before him was everything he'd lost: family, love, the future he'd traded for ambition and ego, and a woman who'd been using him all along. Elizabeth looked up, saw him in the doorway. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no welcome, just exhausted neutrality. "Come closer." James had approached the bed like a supplicant approaching an altar, every step weighted with awareness of his unworthiness. He'd looked down at the baby in Elizabeth's arms and felt the world reshape itself. His son, impossibly small, impossibly perfect, wisps of dark hair, tiny fingers curled into fists, eyes closed in newborn sleep. The tears had come without warning, hot and unstoppable. James had stood at his ex-wife's bedside and wept like he hadn't wept since his mother's funeral, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. The words wouldn't come. "I don't have words." Elizabeth's voice was quiet, measured the voice of someone who'd moved past the worst and found solid ground on the other side. "His name is Daniel William Mitchell. Daniel for my grandfather Hartford, William for your father." James had looked at William, saw the old man's eyes glistening with tears, and understood the honor being bestowed. Not on him, on the man who'd stood by Elizabeth when James had failed her. "Would you like to hold him?" The question had shocked him speechless. After everything he'd done, everything he'd destroyed, she was offering him this, "May I?" Elizabeth had carefully transferred the bundle into his arms. James had held his son with trembling hands, terrified of dropping him, of doing one more thing wrong in a lifetime of wrong choices. Daniel William Mitchell, 8 pounds, 6 ounces. The weight of him was nothing and everything. The warmth of him seeped through the blanket, and James understood with crushing clarity what he'd risked, what he'd nearly lost, what still hung in the balance. The baby's tiny hand had emerged from the blanket, fingers spreading and then curling around James's pinky finger with surprising strength. What would you do? Could you let someone who hurt you so deeply back into your life for your child's sake? Where's the line between forgiveness and protecting yourself? "Daniel," James had whispered, his voice breaking on the name. "I'm your father. I'm going to spend the rest of my life earning the right to deserve that title. I'm going to be better. For you." He'd meant every word. Whether it would be enough was another question entirely. Elizabeth had watched him with those careful eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of boundaries being drawn in steel. "You'll see Daniel 3 times a week, supervised visits at first. William will coordinate the schedule. You'll be a good father, or you'll be removed from his life completely. Do you understand?" "I understand." James had looked down at his son one more time, memorizing every detail of the small face. "Thank you, Elizabeth, for this chance." He'd handed Daniel back the loss of that small weight like losing something vital. He'd kissed his son's forehead with infinite gentleness, and then he'd left because staying would have been selfish, and he was trying to learn what it meant to put someone else first. In the hospital corridor, walking back toward the elevators, James had passed a window looking out over Manhattan. The city glittered below, indifferent to personal catastrophes. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights, Rebecca Stone was probably celebrating. Somewhere else, Sterling Industries employees were reading the news and wondering if they'd have jobs next month. And here in this hospital room, a woman he'd betrayed was giving him a chance he didn't deserve for the sake of a child who would never know his father as anything but a cautionary tale unless James could somehow become someone different. And in that hospital room, with her newborn son in her arms and her ex-husband's tears still hanging in the air, Elizabeth Hartford. Mitchell understood something profound. Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing what to rebuild and what to let go. She could give Daniel a father. She couldn't give James another chance. And she was finally at peace with that. 6 months had passed since the gala, and the world had shifted on its axis. Sterling Industries' annual shareholder meeting took place in the same grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, where everything had fallen apart. Elizabeth had chosen the venue deliberately, a statement about reclamation, about transforming the site of disaster into the stage for resurrection. 1,000 shareholders filled the space, along with financial analysts, reporters, and board members who'd watched Sterling Industries navigate the most turbulent period in its 50-year history. The atmosphere was nothing like that poisonous night in December. This was businesslike, focused, energized by curiosity about what came next. Elizabeth stood backstage checking her appearance in a full-length mirror. Navy Armani suit tailored to perfection. Hair pulled back in a severe bun. Minimal makeup. She looked like exactly what she was, a chief executive who'd stabilized a company in free fall and emerged stronger. Daniel sat in a carrier beside her, 6 months old now, watching the world with bright, alert eyes. Bringing him to a shareholder meeting was unconventional, potentially controversial. Elizabeth didn't care. She was done performing other people's expectations of what a CEO should be. William appeared in the doorway, distinguished in charcoal gray, looking every inch the patriarch he'd always been. Ready, as I'll ever be. You've done remarkable work, my dear. Margaret would be so proud. He looked down at Daniel, his expression softening. And she would have adored her grandson. Elizabeth picked up the carrier, Daniel's weight familiar and grounding. Let's show them what we've built. The walk to the podium felt like crossing a threshold. 6 months ago, she'd walked through this same ballroom in silver Valentino, 8 months pregnant, watching her marriage detonate in real time. Now she walked in as CEO with her son beside her and the company's future secured. The applause when she took the podium was genuine, warm. Nothing like the performative noise of that December night. These people had watched her stabilize Sterling Industries when everyone predicted collapse. They'd profited from her leadership. They respected what she'd accomplished. Elizabeth set Daniel's carrier on a small table beside the podium, visible to the audience, a deliberate statement that she wasn't hiding motherhood or pretending it didn't exist. Then she turned to face 1,000 pairs of eyes. Good morning. 6 months ago, this company nearly fell to the most sophisticated corporate fraud I've ever encountered. We survived because we chose integrity over ambition. We chose family over empire. We chose truth over comfortable lies. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. Financial results stark and impressive. Sterling Industries' second quarter earnings, $2.1 billion in revenue, up 15% year over year. Stock price $245, an all-time high. The merger that would have destroyed us is canceled. The fraud that targeted us is being prosecuted, and we are stronger than we have ever been. The applause was thunderous. These were shareholders who'd watched their investment nearly evaporate and then surge to record levels. They had every reason to celebrate. Elizabeth advanced to the next slide. I'm honored to report that your board of directors has voted to remove my interim title. As of this morning, I am the permanent chief executive officer of Sterling Industries. Standing ovation. Even the journalists were on their feet. Elizabeth let it wash over her, this moment of vindication, before gesturing for them to sit. We've launched 3 new distribution hubs in the past 6 months using infrastructure designs I developed 5 years ago. We've partnered with Johns Hopkins Medical Center on artificial intelligence-driven supply prediction, the legitimate version of what Phoenix Innovations promised and failed to deliver. And we've established the Margaret Mitchell Ethics Foundation, named for William Mitchell's late wife, to promote corporate governance standards and prevent the kind of fraud that nearly destroyed us. More applause, but Elizabeth raised a hand for silence. She had more to say, and this part mattered. I want to address the question everyone's too polite to ask directly: what about James Mitchell? The room went absolutely still. This was the scandal they'd all followed, the human drama beneath the corporate maneuvering. Elizabeth's voice remained steady, professional, stripped of emotion. James Mitchell is no longer CEO of Sterling Industries. He no longer has operational authority. He remains a shareholder and serves on the board in a non-executive advisory capacity. More importantly, he is the father of my son. She gestured toward Daniel, who chose that moment to make a small sound, drawing chuckles from the audience. Over the past 6 months, James has worked with federal investigators to build their case against Rebecca Stone. His testimony was crucial to her conviction. He has been a present, engaged father to Daniel Humble, where he was once arrogant, careful, where he was once reckless. He has demonstrated that people can learn from catastrophic mistakes. Elizabeth paused, letting that settle. James has asked me multiple times if there is a path back to us being married. My answer has been and remains no. Trust, once shattered at that level, cannot be rebuilt to what it was. But respect can be earned. Effective co-parenting can be achieved. And I believe James is on that path. The cameras found James sitting in the back row of the shareholder section, not on stage, not at the VIP tables. Present but diminished, no longer entitled to more than what he'd earned through 6 months of humble work. He nodded slightly when the cameras turned to him, acknowledgement without presumption. Elizabeth continued, "This company was built by William Mitchell on principles of integrity and service. It nearly fell because those principles were forgotten in pursuit of growth for growth's sake. Under my leadership, we will grow, but never at the expense of what makes us worth preserving. Character is strategy. Integrity is strength. And family, however we define it, is the real empire we're building." The applause lasted 90 seconds. Elizabeth stood at the podium, Daniel beside her, and understood that this moment was the true coronation, not the merger announcement that had blown up in James's face, but this quiet assertion of competence, values, and strength. Federal court in the Southern District of New York was less dramatic than television made it seem. Courtroom 15A was wood-paneled and fluorescent lit, the gallery filled with reporters and legal observers watching Rebecca Stone's trial wind toward its inevitable conclusion. Elizabeth attended the final day of testimony, sitting in the third row with William beside her. She'd watched 3 weeks of evidence presentation testimony from FBI agents and forensic accountants, the steady accumulation of proof that Rebecca Stone had orchestrated a conspiracy to commit securities fraud on a massive scale. Rebecca sat at the defense table in a gray suit, her expression carefully neutral. She'd lost weight during the trial, her face sharper, harder. But she hadn't lost her composure. Even facing a dozen felony counts, she maintained the appearance of someone merely inconvenienced by circumstance. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. On the count of securities fraud in the first degree, how do you find? The forewoman stood. Guilty. On the count of wire fraud in the first degree, guilty. 12 counts. 12 guilty verdicts. Rebecca Stone's face remained impassive as her freedom evaporated count by count. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Elizabeth attended that as well, curious to see how this chapter would close. Judge Morrison had reviewed the pre-sentencing report with evident distaste. "Ms. Stone, you orchestrated a scheme of remarkable sophistication and breathtaking cynicism. You used your intimate knowledge of the target to plan a corporate assassination that would have cost thousands of people their jobs and their savings. You subverted board members with bribes. You created shell corporations to profit from the chaos you intended to create. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated destruction for personal revenge and financial gain." Rebecca stood ramrod straight, her lawyer beside her, both of them waiting for the hammer to fall. "I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison with credit for time served. You will pay $250 million in fines and restitution to Sterling Industries and its shareholders. You are prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company for life." 15 years. Rebecca would be 49 years old when she was released. As the marshals approached to take her into custody, Rebecca turned and looked directly at Elizabeth. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and something passed between them, recognition perhaps, an acknowledgement of the game they'd played and how it had ended. Elizabeth stood and walked toward the defense table. The marshals paused, uncertain. Rebecca's lawyer looked alarmed, but Rebecca herself showed only curiosity. Elizabeth stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak quietly. "You won't believe this, but I don't hate you." Rebecca's eyebrow arched. "No. You forgot that business isn't war. It's people's lives, families, legacies. You were so focused on destroying James that you didn't care about the collateral damage. That's why you lost." Rebecca smiled, cold and knowing. "I'll be out in 8 years with good behavior. I'll be 42, still young enough to rebuild. And when I get out—" "You'll be 42, Elizabeth interrupted. "Still brilliant, still capable of remarkable things. I genuinely hope you build something real next time, something that doesn't require destroying other people. You're smart enough to do it." Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, surprise maybe, or the faint recognition that the woman standing before her had won by becoming something Rebecca had never managed to be, someone who built instead of demolished. Then the moment passed. Rebecca turned toward the marshals, and Elizabeth walked back to William. They left the courthouse together, emerging into bright June sunlight. "That was gracious of you," William observed. "It was strategic. Generosity costs nothing and denies her the satisfaction of knowing she hurt me." William smiled. "You're more like your grandfather every day." He would have been very proud. Daniel's first birthday party was intimate by billionaire standards. 30 people gathered at William's estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Family, close friends, the board members who'd stood with Elizabeth during the crisis. No press, no photographers, just the private celebration of a child who'd been born into chaos and was growing up in stability. Daniel had taken his first steps that morning, wobbling across William's study with the determined concentration of a drunk person navigating a straight line. James had been there for it. His supervised visit happened to coincide with the milestone, and he'd caught Daniel as the boy pitched forward, both of them laughing. Elizabeth had watched from the doorway, her heart doing complicated things. She couldn't forgive James. She couldn't trust him. But watching him be gentle with their son, watching him show up week after week with patience and humility, she could acknowledge that he was trying to earn back his humanity. In the late afternoon, when most of the guests had left and Daniel was napping upstairs, William asked Elizabeth to join him in the library, the same room where they'd planned the counteroffensive 6 months ago. The fireplace was cold now, June sunlight streaming through the tall windows. William pulled a leather portfolio from his desk drawer. "I wanted to discuss something with you before I make it official with my attorneys." Elizabeth settled into one of the leather chairs. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous. Necessary." William opened the portfolio, removing a document. "This is my will. I'm leaving my 19% of Sterling Industries to Daniel, held in trust until he turns 25. You'll serve as trustee." Elizabeth started to object. "William, you don't have to." "I do. Because combined with your 17%, that means when Daniel inherits the Hartford Mitchell family, we'll permanently control 36% of Sterling Industries. No hostile takeover will ever succeed. No Rebecca Stone will ever threaten what we've built. Your son will inherit a company his family controls and a legacy of integrity." The weight of it settled over Elizabeth. She was building something that would last generations, not through conquest or aggression, but through patient accumulation of power and refusal to compromise on values. "James was my son." William continued, his voice rougher now. "I loved him. I still love him. But he was never meant to be king. You were. I see that now. You have your grandfather Hartford's strategic mind and your grandmother's spine. You upheld the principles Margaret and I built this company on. And you're raising Daniel to understand that power is responsibility, not privilege." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, William, for trusting me, for standing with me when it would have been easier to stand with your son. You gave me a grandson and saved my life's work. The least I can do is ensure it passes to the right hands." That evening, after the guests had departed and Daniel was asleep in the nursery, William had created for him. Elizabeth sat in the window seat looking out over the Connecticut landscape, manicured lawns rolling down to the tree line, stone walls marking property boundaries, the solidity of old money and older values. She thought about the journey from that museum gala, where she'd met James through 5 years of feeling invisible, to the catastrophic implosion at the plaza, to this moment of hard-won stability. What had she learned about herself? That silence was never weakness. It was strategy. That her contributions didn't need external validation to be real. That she'd never needed James's approval or recognition. She had value that existed independent of anyone else's acknowledgement. What had she learned about power? That real power prepared in darkness and struck in light. That institutions like the SEC and FBI worked if you worked them properly. That the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was building something better and outlasting your enemies. What had she learned about forgiveness? that you could let someone be a parent without letting them be a partner. That redemption was possible, but never owed. That setting boundaries was the highest form of love, not cruelty. How often do we chase what glitters and ignore what endures? How often do we mistake the spotlight for the stage, the applause for the achievement? James Mitchell had everything and lost it in a single kiss. But perhaps in losing everything, he found what actually mattered. Sometimes the greatest empire we build isn't made of steel and stock. It's made of second chances, earned trust, and the quiet dignity of doing what's right after doing everything wrong. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a message from James. "Thank you for letting me be part of Daniel's birthday. He's the best thing I've ever been part of creating." She read it twice before responding. "He deserves a father who shows up. Keep showing up." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement that James was doing the work, and that was all she could ask from him. 5 years passed with the steady accumulation of small victories and incremental growth. Sterling Industries expanded into telemedicine logistics, partnered with 3 major hospital networks, grew its employee base to 30,000 people across North America. The stock price climbed steadily, 260, 293, 1034. Shareholders got rich. Employees got raises. The company became known for stability and ethical leadership in an industry often characterized by neither. Elizabeth turned 38. Daniel turned 5, precocious and curious, already showing signs of inheriting his